This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. The much discussed revision to the EU GMP Annex 1 is expected to be published early this year, bringing some major changes to drug developers' current process and manufacturing methods for sterile products. Although the draft revision has been widely shared and commented on, it is still unclear of the total impact this document may have across regulated industries. So here to share his perspective on the Annex 1 revision document is Patrick Nieuwenhuizen from PharmaLex. Welcome, Patrick. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I really appreciate your insights into this as Annex 1. Although a European document, definitely has impact globally. And the last revision to this document came in 2017 with a draft revision in the works for the past couple of years. So people have had time to look at this and ask their questions and make their comments. But my question to you is, what is Annex 1 and what's the importance in pharmaceutical manufacturing?
Okay, well, Annex 1, it's part of a bigger collection of documents of the Biologics, at the moment Biologics Volume 4, and it basically translates or interprets the basic principles of GMP from what is now the European directive, 2003/94 EEC. It's quite old document. It was first published in 1971, and it was revised a few times on some points, but never fully revised. And as the title of the Annex 1 implies, it is the European guidance document for the manufacturing of sterile products. And it provides guidance on the minimum controls that pharmaceutical companies are required to have implemented to produce medicinal products that are required to be sterile. So all these manufacturers, they have to comply with these requirements to minimize basically the risk of microbial, particulate, and pyrogen contamination that comes from microbes in the final product. So it's a very important document, as you can imagine, as it outlines all these different requirements that ultimately gives a higher level of assurance that your final product is sterile.
Excellent, thank you. Just for the little bit of background on that. And so, Patrick, some of the greatest proposed changes to Annex 1 are seen with clean rooms, clean air systems, and environmental monitoring. Why is that so important now? Why are those items, do you think, so important now?
Well, as I said, the document itself, it's originated from 1971. And over the last couple of decades, the pharmaceutical industry, they have evolved very rapidly with the involvement and development of new technologies, many medicines that are emerging, such as cell and gene therapy, personalized medicines. And besides, as I answered in the previous question, besides some other updates, it was never fully revised. So it never accounted for these new technologies. And it didn't account for these changes that we have seen throughout the pharmaceutical industry. So to basically reinforce the existing EU requirements, but also to keep up to date with these new technologies and insights. For example, isolated technology, rapid microbiological methods. The Annex 1 was revised with the new draft published in December 2017, as we all know. So you could say in 2017, it was a bit of an early Christmas present from the EU regulators for the world of sterile manufacturing, as you can imagine.
Right, right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that Christmas gift, right? But but seriously, I guess as technologies have changed and as, clean environmental monitoring efforts or technologies have changed, then it makes sense that the guidance surrounding them needs to be updated and changed too.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we mentioned that Annex 1 is a European document, part of the Biologics. Why do global manufacturers need to pay attention to the changes here?
Well, yes, it is a European published document, but why do global manufacturers need to pay attention to these changes as well? It's first and foremost, like a lot of manufacturers, they also provide their drug products and medicinal products to the European markets, so they have to take into account for that. But also, if you look at the Annex working group that was involved with the revision of this document, it included a wide range of countries from across the world and international organizations like the WHO and the PICS, which also have input from the US. So, and they adopted these changes and recommendations as such, and therefore it will exceed the European boundaries as such. So, and that's why it's so important that global manufacturers, they need to pay close attention to what's coming.
Yeah, particularly if they have products that are being sold in or through Europe, then these are the rules they have to follow, right? Yeah. Absolutely. So you mentioned sterile manufacturing, and a lot of the changes have to do with sterility. So is it strictly applicable to sterile manufacturing, or should non-sterile manufacturers be concerned with this as well?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting one, and I think that is a big change compared to the current Annex 1. If you look at the scope of the new Annex 1, which is basically the very first chapter of the new Annex 1, there is a paragraph, and that describes, and it's almost a literal text, that some of the principles and guidance, they also may be used to support the manufacture of other products that are not intended to be sterile. So in one of the very first paragraphs of the new Annex 1, it says like, hey, you need to apply maybe some of these principles and guidances to your products that are not intended to be sterile. So although it is not mandatory, you can expect that regulatory bodies will also look at how a company applies certain aspects of the Annex 1, and they look for a very good justification or the rationale why certain aspects would not be adopted, or why they have been adopted and how are these implemented. A good example is, for instance, the design of your premises, the justification of how your clean room classifications are designed, and also selecting the gowning and cleaning regime that is applicable. So that is not only applicable for the sterile manufacturing of products, but also for non-sterile manufacturing. So it is expected that manufacturers use the principles, what they call quality risk management, to determine which of these points of the Annex 1 are also applicable to their non-sterile manufacturing processes.
Sure, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
So digging a little bit deeper into the document, and particularly around the changes to the document, what are some of the most pertinent and impactful changes over the previous version?
Yeah, first, what is very apparent, of course, and that everybody was, I think, very surprised is the size of the document. While the current Annex 1 is covering about 16 pages, if you look at the new Annex 1, the new draft version, it spans 52 pages. So there is much more information and detail in the expectations, while the new Annex 1 tries to strike a balance of not being too prescriptive, as it would be very restrictive, as you can imagine, of course. One of the hugely debated items that people came across was like the benefits or the disadvantages about what they call the pre-use post-sterilization integrity testing, or PUPSIT, of filters. Many companies, they expressed they would expect it would achieve the opposite. Instead of an increased level of sterility assurance, it may damage filters. So that was a big debate, and still we don't know actually if that is going to be maintained. So that is a big impact item.
Oh.
Next one, also the new Annex 1 makes reference to the principles of quality risk management, or QRM, and it puts very much emphasis from the start of the document that QRM should be used as a proactive tool in your manufacturing process. And with the advantages and the advances, of pharmaceutical manufacturing in general, and specifically for this annex in sterile manufacturing technology, more emphasis is made on, say, clean room design and the consideration of new technologies like barrier technologies, wraps, isolators, etc. So that is more explicitly expressed as well. Also, there is now a dedicated utilities section that goes into more detail about basically the expectations they have around these utilities and how these are managed. These, for example, they include the water systems, gas and vacuum systems, and they were not included in the current Annex 1. So there is much more detail around that. And then, of course, last but not least, the big item is a requirement for manufacturers to have a formal written and implemented contamination control strategy in place. That is a document that presents the total sum basically of measures that are in place to prevent or to reduce the risk for your process, utilities and product contamination. And there would ultimately, of course, pose a risk to the patient. So that will be a massive impact on some of the manufacturers, of course. And as mentioned before, the new Annex 1, it also goes beyond the manufacturing of sterile products, and the scope is broadened. So it will also have an impact to those companies involved with the manufacturing of non-sterile products, as we have seen before.
And is that contamination control document that's now required or will be required under Annex 1, is that a new document for most manufacturers?
To a certain extent, like contamination control, it was there for a good while. There was already an expectation to have it in place, but it was never expressed as such that black and white that you should have it in place. Typically, a company has a scattered collection of documents that basically individually describe some aspects of contamination control. Now it is the expectation that this is all combined together in one document that provides complete overview, like what controls do you have in place and what measures do you have in place to basically prevent contamination of your process or a system. So while a lot of companies, especially with the publication of the very first and the second draft of the Annex 1, they started to realize they have to work on this contamination control strategy document.
Sure. So it sounds like they're just, with Annex 1, they're really just formalizing expectations that have been there.
Exactly.
And making it an easier to access document, probably, in part for regulators, but also as a series of checks and balances for the manufacturer.
Yeah.
So, we hear a lot about risk management in the revised Annex 1 document. You mentioned QRM. Can you explain how the two are linked in this revision and what that means for legacy systems and processes?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, the current Annex 1, if you look at it, it doesn't make a reference to QRM of quality risk management at all. And with the global acceptance and the implementation of ICH Q9 that is dedicated to quality risk management, but also to ICH Q10, which talks about pharmaceutical quality systems across the pharmaceutical industry, QRM is now fully embedded and expected to be used in a proactive manner in the Annex 1. And the thought process behind this is that applying QRM, it enhances the process understanding by the manufacturers and also supports patient safety. It basically forces manufacturers to demonstrate how they have the knowledge, how their processes works, and how they interlink with each other and what the potential vulnerabilities are within a process like this and how they can be mitigated or remediated. So, regarding legacy process systems, like when designing or operating a facility, there's an expectation that there is a retrospective review and that is completed with the risk mitigation plan in place and rolled out, that you actually can see like, okay, we have identified these weaknesses and this is what we're going to do to make it stronger and to prevent contamination altogether.
Yeah, excellent. I think, as for some companies who are much further down the road with their quality risk management systems and have reached what we call maturity, then, the risks, they can see that the risks are less than those companies who maybe, haven't quite gotten there yet.
Exactly. And the whole, it should not be a tick box like quality risk management, and it shouldn't be done to basically please the regulators. It's all about like your understanding of your vulnerabilities and basically prevent things from happening. And that can be done very easily with legacy systems as well, because you gain a much more and a better understanding if you have a good quality risk management system in place.
Yeah, precisely. And ideally, you're able to prioritize risks and figure out, where the higher risks are and lower risks are in your own organization and account for that. Yeah,
absolutely.
Patrick, what challenges do you see for manufacturers and regulatory bodies in the implementation here of the newly revised Annex 1?
I think for both parties, it's about the interpretation of the updated principles and guidance. First, it challenges companies how the principles and guidance of the new Annex 1 are implemented and put into practice in their own situation, of course. And for that, the companies need to demonstrate that they have a solid understanding of their facilities, their utilities, processes, and their products, of course, and how these are complying and in compliance with the Annex 1. So what rationales and what justifications are in place for the practices deployed, and are these adequate to guarantee a safe product? Of course, that all needs to be documented. So that's a big challenge, because often there's a lot of knowledge known in these companies, but especially with this whole focus on quality risk management, the contamination control strategy, there is now a larger expectation that these are documented. And then, of course, if you have documented it, will these be accepted by the regulators? And especially what we spoke about just previously about the aging facilities or legacy systems. Equally, of course, for regulators, and therewith also for the manufacturers, I would say, is the challenge how strict they interpreted these Annex 1 text and guidelines. Again, the Annex 1 is there to cover the entire spectrum of sterile manufacturing. And now also some aspects of non-sterile manufacturing are included. So the document is intended not to be too prescriptive. So there is a certain allowance for interpretation and application of these principles and guidelines. So the challenge is like, okay, how are regulators going to be dealing with this? So like for manufacturers, regulators need to have a good understanding of the updated Annex 1 text themselves.
As I'm listening to you talk, it's sounding a little bit like that there's been an increase in the amount of documentation or the expectations around documentation with this. Yeah. So do you expect that an increased burden around documentation will also provide some challenges for manufacturers?
I would say so. Typically, say a company would have a robust validation package, and they put it on the shelf, and then they pull it out when, say, a regulatory inspection comes up. Now there's this expectation that there's a more continuous involvement about the risks. Say, if you have deviations coming up, how do they all interlink with the overall risk to your product? And that needs to be much better documented nowadays. Yeah.
Okay. So now the $1 million question, when is it expected to become effective? And do you think there's going to be a grace period for implementation once it is released?
Well, the latest news or rumors is that it appears that the latest revision is with the European Commission now for sign off. And the word is that it could be made effective as soon as by the end of March. It is expected that there will be a grace period for some elements, like we had with the provision that became effective in 2009, where the provisions, for example, for capping of vials had a grace period of 1 year.
Okay.
In this case, if you look at the current provision and the text that is out in the public, for example, the 100% integrity testing of containers that are closed by fusion. At the moment, not many companies, they have the ability and they have the readiness for such testing. So it will take a considerable amount of time to assess and implement a feasible test solution and strategy for manufacturers to meet such requirements. And there are other examples that would just require more time to be fully in compliance. So yeah, although we don't know for sure how long and if there would be a grace period, it is expected there will be a grace period for some elements at least.
And how do you expect really this to impact the industry in the short term and, medium term, I guess, once Annex 1 does become effective?
Yeah, well, as I said, the new Annex 1, it surely contains more information compared to the current revision, and it covers more aspects of sterile manufacturing. And although the first revision was out since the end of 2017, and people and companies had the opportunity to prepare themselves, there's still uncertainty what would make the cut. It became a little bit more apparent, of course, when the second draft was published in February 2020. Mm-hmm. And it is not expected that the final version deviates too much from this. However, we still don't know for sure, of course.
Right.
What you already see is that companies start to realize that it is really coming. And so they must be very familiar with the upcoming revision.
Yeah. So they've had a couple of years to sort of think some of these aspects through.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And for that, not only the new Annex 1 must be understood, but also requires a very good understanding, as I mentioned before, of their own sterile manufacturing or non-sterile manufacturing process, and how quality risk management is an intrinsic part of that. What we see is that, yes, everybody is familiar with the principles of quality risk management, but in many cases, the actual application of quality risk management, there is room for improvement. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it requires a good understanding and correct application of risk management tools and how quality risk management is embedded within the organization, not only as a once-off, but on a continuous basis, whereby risks are evaluated and reassessed. So that, I think, will be a big impact to companies.
Sure. And quality risk management is not a new concept, to anyone who's in the pharmaceutical or medical device manufacturing world. So, they've spent time thinking about this anyway. And of course, like every regulatory guidance that we have, we don't look at them in isolation or in a vacuum, right? There's other regulatory guidances as well out there, and for example, ISO, and then who has some? You mentioned PICS. The FDA has regulations or guidances too, and I imagine there's some overlap, and so some of these items are, while being revised currently in Annex 1, exist in other places. Yeah. Yes,
exactly, and that is the whole, well, to my experience, when you're reading the Annex 1, there's a lot of new information, but it's not actually that new. To your point, there is a lot of guidance and already other documents and other regulations in place that make a reference to these aspects. So while it is now more prominent in Annex 1, in itself, it's not that new.
You're right. They're just bringing it into alignment with other regulations that are there. So do you anticipate a change in what manufacturers should expect during routine investigations or audits as a result of Annex 1?
Yes, and again, sorry for repeating myself, but there will be much more emphasis on the use of quality risk management in a proactive manner. There will be more of an expectation that there is a risk-based rationale for the procedures and processes in place and how these all interact and work together. Again, to guarantee product quality and therewith patient safety. One item sticking out and very much related to quality risk management is the expectation that the company has this contamination control strategy in place, which will be subject to scrutiny during audits and assessed how it is maintained. And that it is kept alive and reevaluated on a frequent basis, rather than that is a document that is sitting on a shelf. And as we mentioned before, quality risk management is not new, and the ICH Q9 about quality risk management is in place already since 2005. It becomes now much more apparent. As you might realize, there is also a new ICH Q9 draft out since November for public consultation as well. So you can see these are all basically coming together.
Right.
And therefore, I would expect that regulators will also pay more attention to the overall quality risk management program of a company and how it is embedded.
Yeah, I would agree. And even here in the States, the FDA has been working on a quality management maturity program. And I haven't seen the Annex 1 document recently, but I have to think that all of the agencies are working to sort of align these concepts and these ideas around risk management.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So I think we've covered a lot today, and now we just have to wait for the document to come out.
Yeah, it's very true.
so we can, give it the once over and start to implement, some of these changes. And to your point, I think the contamination control strategy sounds like it's one of the biggest changes. Do you have a sense, before we wrap up today, do you have a sense if they provide specifics around their expectations for that particular controlled document, or is it, more so suggesting that you have one and then it's up to the manufacturer to figure out how they're going to roll that out?
Yeah, well, there is, throughout the whole Annex 1 document, there is good guidance of what they expect that is included, is to be included as part of your contamination control strategy. So that, of course, can be used to develop your own contamination strategy. And while there is no silver bullet about what would a good contamination control strategy look like, there are many bad examples that I've come across. So where in many cases, the document is just created without further follow-up or reassessment. And as I said, the new Annex 1 outlines what elements should be addressed in a company's contamination control strategy. And there is this expectation that it should be a living document with quality risk management principles applied to that. So if you identify a risk or a weakness in your system, how are you going to address this? How are you going to improve the situation or reduce the risk, basically?
Excellent. So, Patrick, again, I thank you for your time. Great insights here. I think our listeners have an idea of what's coming down the pike, and are anticipating the release, hopefully, sometime in the next month or so. What last thoughts or concepts would you like to leave us with today?
Yeah, of course, and really enjoyed to talk about it. So thanks again for that. It's only a brief overview, and we haven't covered all aspects of the new Annex 1. So there will be other things that we haven't touched base on. And of course, it's still not known what the exact text is of the final version. But it will not be too far from the text that we have seen in February 2020. And as we said before, while there is a lot of additional information with the new Annex 1, most of it is not new and it's already current expectation and practice within the industry. And there are many other documents that we have seen. My final thoughts is, and a lot of companies have started, is make sure your company is familiar with the new Annex 1 text. And equally important, it should not only be QA who carries this knowledge. In contrary, I would say, as the Annex 1 is applicable to all aspects of sterile manufacturing, it should be cross-functional to ensure that the responsible personnel and the managers know the impact of the new Annex 1 to their area of expertise. And that basically enforces company, empowers company to do the right thing.
Absolutely.
And as we have learned, some of the elements, they can also be used for non-sterile manufacturing. So be aware about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the guidance, even though it's pointed at the sterile manufacturers, there's still some best practices in there for good manufacturing practices in general. So we encourage everyone to make sure they read through and understand where the changes are and how they impact your organization specifically. Exactly. Well, thank you again, Patrick, for sharing your thoughts on these regulatory updates and implementation strategies. It's been so great to have you with us today. I really, really appreciate your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And it was very nice to talk to you, Stacey. Thanks again.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Patrick. Hey, I also want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, I'm sending out my thanks to you, our valued listeners. I appreciate your time each week, as well as your help in sharing this podcast and all of the great information that comes from it. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, don't forget to leave us a review or send us a quick note online. We'd love to hear from you. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another informative and timely discussion. Until then, make it a great week.